Hi, thanks for joining me with the Apologist Bookshelf. I'm Gary Zacharias. I want to tackle a book by Hugh Ross. Hugh's an amazing guy, interesting guy. I got a chance to meet him and talk to him, and I've listened to a lot of his information over the years. He's founder and president. I think he retired recently, but founder and president of Reasons to Believe. He's written a lot of books. He's an astrophysicist. He's spoken on something like 300 campuses in the U.S. and abroad on all sorts of science faith topics. His organization, Reasons to Believe, is trying to integrate science and faith, which I think he does a nice job on. Now, not everybody's going to agree with you. He's considered an old earther, meaning he thinks the earth really is billions of years old and that the creation events happened over a long period of time. He's not an evolutionist. He's said that over and over again. He doesn't think single cells on their own turned into us today, from microbes to man. He doesn't buy that at all. He thinks God intervened and had to create periodically throughout the period of the Earth's history. So he's got a book that I wanted to look at today. It's called A Matter of Days. And he's dealing with questions like, well, how long were the creation days of Genesis? Were they hours or epochs of time? And of course, he's going to come down on epochs of time. He says another question that he's going to deal with is, does belief in an old earth equate to belief in evolution? And his answer is going to be no. And then he tackles things like, was there any kind of death before the fall? Young earthers are going to say no. And so he's going to deal with that one as well. Well, he's dealing with an interesting issue, isn't he? The length of the creation days. There's just a storm of controversy, which is kind of a shame. I think Christians kind of shoot themselves, when they deal with this issue. We should have grace and kindness toward those that disagree with us, because none of us know. We really don't know. The one thing we are sure of is that evolution, a godless, mindless, random kind of evolution, is not what happened to the earth here, but how it all happened is still pretty much up in the air. But I want to take a look at his book, Matter of Days. Some people have commented on it. I'm looking at the back of the book here. Jack Hayford, who is founder and chancellor of the King's University, says, Hugh Ross's spiritual depth and brilliance of mind is the rarest of blends. He addresses the topic of creation, opening many thoughtful minds and hearts to the message of salvation, providing them new reasons to believe. Craig Keener, really well-known speaker and theologian, 3 decades ago, when I was still an atheist, a work like this one could have satisfied my own objections to Genesis. This book should help many Christians to stop fighting about how God created and get back to our business of proclaiming that he did it. I think that's a good one, so avoid the fight. All right, so I'm going to pick one chapter here. This is chapter 11. I like it a lot. He calls it Young Earth Darwinism, ? You got that title, Young Earth? Now, we usually think of Young Earth creationism, but he titles this chapter Young Earth Darwinism. So he said, and he's right, he said, so many people have been influenced by the beliefs of Young Earth creationists. And he said, a lot of people think if you accept a long creation time scale, that's like saying that those single cells turned into monkeys and they eventually turned into humans. That gradualism. And he said that's not what he believes, of course. So he said astronomers have, over the years, come up with proofs that the universe is something like 10 to 15 billion years old. And he said a majority of both scientists and Christians mistakenly believed that if you had billions of years, that would give you time for a naturalistic account of life. In other words, why do you need God if you got billions of years? But he said recent scholarship, though, has shown that these time boundaries are much smaller than the 10 to 15 billion years. And he said it's constricted evolutionary theory, and it's constricted so tightly, he said it's strangled it. So what he's really saying is a 14 billion year old universe, which is what they estimate now, is just too young for any kind of conceivable natural process to get even a simple organism. Just a simple organism. So he said what young earthers do when they come along and they'll say, well, we want to defend biblical creation. Okay, well, that's a noble goal. But he said then they end up having to defend a recent consecutive calendar day creation week. Do you know what he means by that? I think that makes sense. So what he's saying is it's recent. So most young earthers will say 6,000 to 10,000 years ago is when creation happened on Earth. So it's recent, it's consecutive, one event after the next, and it's built on calendar day creation week. So in other words, day one, let's call it Monday, for example. So you go Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. So every 24-hour periods, there was a new creation event. So within literally a single week of time, everything got here that's here today. All right, so he said, there's some irony to this, though. He said, people who are young earthers, who rip criticisms at old earth creationists, they call them evolutionists. He said, they're ending up, because of their own interpretation of Scripture, to be hyper-evolutionists. He says, in other words, they're saying that the natural process evolution is super efficient. He says that even exceeds those of the most ardent evolutionists themselves. So what do they mean? What's he talking about here? Okay, so let's go through this, and this is where he slows down to give us some information. He says young earth creationists, right, they look at the fall, that's Adam and Eve's sin, and then they look at the Genesis flood, and he says, based on those things, they end up with ultra-efficient biological evolution. Why? Well, young earth creationists are going to have an explanation for the huge number of new species of animals, such as carnivores especially, that they say appeared suddenly after the fall and proliferated again in the short span since the flood of Noah's day. Right, so you got that. So how'd these creatures get here if God didn't create them? In other words, you got the fall. Okay, God's done creating. People sin. God puts the flood out there to wipe out people. And then you got all these animals that come along after the flood. How'd they get here? God's not creating them. So he says, go back, look at what the young earth teaching is. The animals, according to young earthers, animals ate only plants until Adam and Eve rebelled. So they assume that carnivorous activity came about because of human sin. So what are they saying then? So young earthers are going to say that all meat-eating creatures alive now and in the fossil record had to have evolved rapidly and dramatically from those early plant-eating creatures that God made when he created everything in that creation week. So the carnivores are a later addition, right? They had to evolve rapidly. So that's a problem. So here's what the young earthers are going to say. There's a global flood worldwide, all across the earth. It wiped out all the land-dwelling, air-breathing life on earth, except the ones in Noah's Ark. And virtually all the Earth's fossils and geological features came from this cataclysmic event. So it says, now there's a problem. He says the size of Noah's Ark and the limited number of people on board are going to present a problem. He said even if the animals, let's say, hibernated while the flood was going on, the Ark's maximum carrying capability by young earthers are something like 30,000 pairs of land animals. Okay, so you got that? Roughly 30,000 land animals. By the way, he has footnotes, so he's not making this up. He'll show you where he got this information from young earth proponents. But he says, the fossil record says there were at least 100 million such species, of which more than 5 million live on Earth today. Okay, so remember, in the Ark, according to the young earthers, there's something like 30,000 pairs of land animals, but we've got 5 million today. So how did these all come about? So that implies that after the flood, according to the young earth position, after the flood, the number of species goes from 30,000 to millions. He says the problem gets worse. Young earthers say right after the flood, there were some dinosaurs on board. They went extinct. So now you don't have that 30,000 anymore. So the remaining few thousand species that managed to survive the flood have evolved by hugely rapid natural processes into these millions of species. So he gives you some specific places to look at for that kind of information. Henry Morris and John Whitcomb, these are young earthers, in their book, The Genesis Flood, say that zebras, horses, and other horse-like species evolved from a single horse-like pair on the ark. I mean, it doesn't make much sense, does it, for Noah to have to put on every animal that was kind of like a horse? So there was just a pair, two horse-like species. After the flood, they start expanding and evolving into zebras, horses, and so on. So it said they each, other young earthers will say that the entire cat family evolved from maybe just one or maybe two or three cat pairs on Noah's Ark. So out of those small numbers coming off the Ark, today you end up with tigers and lions and leopards and cheetahs and panthers and bobcats and on and on and on. So it says, Hugh Ross finds that pretty ironic. Creation scientists, the young earthers, say then that natural biological evolution was really efficient. It worked great. It brought these single pairs down to today where we've got dozens and dozens of varieties. He said that's far more, far more efficient evolution than even the most optimistic Darwinist would suggest. One philosopher of science at Columbia said this: the rates of speciation that creation science would require, now he's talking about young earthers, so the rates of speciation, in other words, the getting of new species, are truly breathtaking, orders of magnitude greater than any that have been dreamed of in evolutionary theory. Isn't that interesting? So he says, if you really look at it, this is Hugh Ross again now, animals, especially ones that are really big and advanced, like horses and zebras and cats, they just don't evolve, and they can't evolve under natural conditions at such an extremely rapid rate. So there we go. That's the whole point that he's bringing up. But of course, people say, well, what about mutations? Maybe that happened just over and over again. You get these animals changing because of mutations. But he said, Hugh Ross again, mutations rarely occur, and most non-lethal mutations are neutral. And he said the majority are actually harmful to the species. And he's got footnotes for this, that the ratio of harmful to favorable mutations is something like 10,000 to 1, maybe even 10 million to 1. So if favorable mutation rates are that low, most species can't mutate rapidly enough. He says here's another challenge, the fossil record enigma. He says, talk about the Cambridge explosion and things like that, that you can figure out roughly one new species appears every 5 years, but since the appearance of humans, not one single new mammal species has been observed to come into existence. But see, this contradicts, doesn't it, what the young earthers would say. He says this lack of any significant evidence of any animal speciation recently poses a huge challenge for evolutionists because there are animal extinctions going on, not a lot of animals coming into existence. And Hugh Ross said that actually bothered him when he was young, to see this difference between extinction going on but very little speciation going on. And then as he read the Bible, he said he observed in the creation accounts an answer to this enigma. He kept reading that in all creation, the entire universe is subject to physical laws that God has established for the universe. In Psalm 104, it says all life is going to die off eventually. But the psalmist says that when life died off, God replaced it. So Genesis 1, according to Hugh Ross, says for 6 days God created life and more life, apparently replacing species that went extinct. But on the seventh day, what happened? God ceased from this creating. So he said if Genesis 1 creation days are long time periods, of course that's Hugh Ross's view, the Bible has an explanation for this enigma. It tells why so much animal speciation occurred before the creation of humans and why nothing is happening now after God created Adam and Eve. God stopped creating new life forms. So the abundant evidence for animal speciation before humanity makes sense if God was actively creating new species to replace those going extinct. So Ross says that through 6 creation epochs, right? Now he's not going to call them days. He's going to say periods of time. God created millions of new species, but during the 7th epoch, he rests. So he's ceased from creating these new life forms. And so that's how he's going to end up this chapter. He said, it's kind of sad. He said, level of belief in God is low for life scientists rather than physical scientists. He says the former group, the life scientists, looks at the seventh creation day when God doesn't create, and so they don't see any evidence for God's direct involvement. That's interesting. So one more time, kind of a wrap up here. He said, if you interpret the creation days as tens of millions of years, maybe hundreds of millions of years like Hugh Ross does, that does not lend support to evolutionism. He said even that long period of time is just way too brief to account for some natural origin of life or for life to become more complex by natural processes. So I'll end my podcast here. We all have different views of maybe how everything happened, the way God worked. But the point is, this is one thing I'd really like people to take away from this. You may disagree with Hugh Ross's views, and that's fine. No problem with that. But he is not, and he has said it repeatedly, and he has to say it over and over again because people accuse him of it, he is not an evolutionist. There is not enough time to create these new life forms, even though we've got billions of years. So you might enjoy this. Reasons to Believe is his organization. Look it up sometime. They've got so much good information there. Well, thanks for being part of this podcast, and we'll see you later.